Welcome to Container Gardening, Big Impact in Small Spaces. I'd like to introduce Benton Murphy, who is our presenter for today. Ben is an Extension Master Gardener who joined the Extension Master Gardeners in the fall of 22, in the what he calls the magnificent class of the fall of 22. Ben is originally from rural southern Colorado, where he inherited a love for plants and gardening from his parents. Given the space available to him, Ben has become an adept container gardener, especially with vegetables, including tomatoes and peppers, as well as native plants and plants to attract pollinators. He's also an avid houseplant collector, more than 200 cacti and orchids in his ever-growing collection, which in recent months has expanded outdoors with a collection of cold-hardy cacti. Ben lives in the Fairlington neighborhood of Arlington, Virginia, with his partner Dave, who's an expert woodworker, and their cat, Alakazam. Without any further ado, I'll turn it over to Ben to start his presentation.
Thank you, Annette. I'd like to put a modifier on that. My bossy cat, Alakazam, who kept me up last night. So if I'm looking a little sleepy today, she's the reason why. But welcome to today's conversation on container gardening, big impact in small spaces. Once again, my name is Ben Murphy. I am so overjoyed to be here with you today to share my knowledge set around container gardening with you. One of the wonderful things about being a master gardener is that we get to get together in spaces like this to share ideas, share our thoughts. We're all learning together about these topics. And so please, as we go on in today's conversation, if you have great ideas to share or questions, pop those into the chat. Many gardeners who absolutely love plants and gardening, like me, are challenged by space. Maybe you live in an apartment, maybe you live in a condominium, maybe you do have some outdoor space, but it's shady and you don't really know how to program it. Luckily, container gardening offers a solution to folks who may want to make a big impact in their garden with only a small space. So if that describes your situation, you're in the right place today. Container gardening is really an approach to use our outdoor spaces more efficiently with increased flexibility than traditional garden beds may offer. So today we're really going to be exploring the design and basic science that can be used to create a successful ornamental or vegetable garden in containers. I do want to note that the information that we're sharing today is based on current best management practices researched by the Virginia Cooperative Extension and Master Gardeners who have contributed to this presentation. I'd have to offer a huge thanks and a tip of the hat to Extension Master Gardeners Ann Reed and Alyssa Ford Morell, who originated a lot of this content in previous presentations that I've refreshed and added a little bit more content for today's conversation. So thank you to Ann and Alyssa for bequeathing us with so much great knowledge. Again, today, our goal for you is to walk away from this conversation confident in the knowledge that with appropriate containers and proper care, anything that can be grown in the ground can potentially be grown in a container, given the growing conditions that meet the needs of your plant. We shouldn't be scared of container gardening. So let's go ahead and dive in to today's agenda. Again, our goal today is for you to walk away with container gardening best practices, understanding how to use them and being able to apply them in your own space to create containers of your choice based on those best management practices. We're going to be discussing a wide variety of topics, including planning your garden for your specific goals, choosing the right pot for the right plant, and making sure that growing medium, watering, and fertilizing regimes that you're pulling together are going to work for that particular plant. We're also going to be talking about site location, making sure that your right plant is in the right place in your available space. We'll talk a little bit about general maintenance and care, as well as overwintering for your pots and plants. And we'll close out the conversation today with a couple of interesting and cute ideas to try, especially if you're a more experienced container gardening looking to broaden your goals or dip your toe into something new. So hopefully this will be a great presentation and you'll walk away with some new ideas or maybe with some good tips to start off for the first time. We do want to note before we dive in meaningfully, especially for beginning gardeners, it's okay to start small. In fact, that might be the preferred way for you to do this. So if you've never really taken the plunge into container gardening, if you're a beginner, perhaps focus on one or two containers at first to see what works for you. Try some starter plants or a few vegetables with the same growing conditions. Work for success on a smaller level and then branch out. Get those small wins. Grow your confidence in terms of container gardening and then try a little bit more. If you're an experienced gardener, like some of the folks mentioned in the chat today, maybe this is an opportunity for you to try something new. Try some new plants. Try some native species. Try a fruit tree in a container. The possibilities are really endless when it comes to container gardening. But overall, whether you're new to gardening or you're an experienced gardener, your goals should match your growing conditions in your small space. So there are a lot of different reasons and goals that people have to pull together a container garden. Starting with aesthetics, a pretty collection of pots and containers in your yard can really be an absolute wonderful thing for your neighbors to walk by and see, for you to, have a cup of coffee out on your patio surrounded by your lovely containers. My partner and I and our cat really do enjoy our backyard and our containers. It's a wonderful environment for rest and relaxation, reflection, sitting out there in nature. So I can't emphasize enough. Aesthetics is definitely a main goal that many people have in terms of container gardening. You can also consider container gardening a great way to bring some seasonal theming into your yard or your patio or your deck. We can talk about planting spring bulbs or pansies early on in the growing season to bring that color during the dreary winter months. Summer daisies, zinnias, and tropicals, all sorts of summer blooming plants are really going to thrive for you in containers. In the fall, you could think about chrysanthemums or other colder, hardier, even winter-friendly plants like evergreens or winter hardy vegetables like kale. There's lots of great ways that you can program your containers to bring in that seasonal theme. Someone mentioned herbs. Herb gardening is a great thing that you can do in containers. We're going to talk a little bit about how to do that effectively in today's presentation. You can grow a wide variety of edibles, fruits and vegetables in containers. It's also really a great way to introduce native plants, especially native plants that flower that attract pollinators to your yard to, again, pollinate those lovely fruits and vegetables that you may have in your containers as well. So we want to encourage you to mix and match, bring in fruits and vegetables and pollinators so that you're creating a great ecosystem in your yard with your containers. Containers can also be used to really pull together some sort of privacy screening or trees if you're interested in that. And as Annette mentioned, container gardening is also a great way to have a plant collection. So I've been dipping my toe into some cold hardy cacti that aren't necessarily native, but are beautiful and will survive our winter here in Northern Virginia. So plant collecting species plants is something that you can definitely use when you are considering a container garden. Container gardening really brings a lot of advantages to your yard. One major advantage of container gardening is flexibility. If you're talking about a collection of pots or containers, you're not necessarily locked into one set of plants all year long. You can mix things up, you can move things around, you can move some of your indoor tropicals or house plants out in the summer to supplement your environment out there. Perhaps your tastes are changing in terms of the types of plants that you want to grow. Maybe you're moving more from flowers into vegetables. Maybe you're changing your mind in terms of these things. It's a lot easier to change out a pot than to replant an entire garden bed, believe me. If you don't have a lot of in-ground space or any at all, again, if you're in a condo or an apartment, container gardening is a really great idea for you to try for patios and decks to really program that space that you do have available to you to bring you some joy and potentially some yummy vegetables to have inside your house. If you don't have a lot of money to spare, you can start small with container gardening with one or a few pots and slowly grow your collection over time. It's a great way to affordably dip your toe into gardening. If you hate weeding like me, container gardening can be a real great approach for you. It's a lot easier to prevent or extract weeds from a collection of pots than in some other garden formats. So again, just want to get across to you that the main point here is that container gardening, it does have so many advantages over other formats, and it's such a great way for people to have accessibility in terms of gardening and to bring gardening into your life where other methods wouldn't necessarily allow. Definitely encourage you to try it. So let's talk a little bit about container selection. There's a wonderful array of pots in this picture here. I can just imagine traipsing through this yard for hours on end, finding the prettiest pots that I want to bring into my garden. There's certainly some beautiful ones there. Selection of pots by aesthetics is easy, and it's probably the first thing that some people will think about when they're thinking about putting together a container garden. However, we do want to emphasize that choosing a pot that supports the cultural needs of your plant, as well as matching your favorite aesthetic choices, can be challenging. So hopefully we're going to be giving you some tips today on finding the right pot for the right plant. Just want you to walk away from this conversation knowing that the container material and the size of your container do and will impact the healthy growth of your plant. So you should be considering pots as a significant growth as well as design element. It's not just about the pretty pot. The selection of the pot that you make will have an impact on the success of your particular plant that you choose. Some best bets that we'll mention at a high level here before we go on to some additional detail here for selecting the right kind of pot for your plant is number one, starting out with a clean container. Even if you buy a container fresh from the store, it may contain toxins, pests, and salts. It is always a good idea to clean and rinse your pots before use to make sure that you're not introducing some nasty chemicals into your pot. You also want to make sure that the container that you select is appropriate for the plant, including and especially including the size of the root system. A lot of folks really focus on the above the soil elements of the plant, but below the soil line, obviously there's a rich root system, hopefully, that you're going to be forming in these pots. So you need to be thinking about selecting containers that will be appropriate for the size of the root system of the plant that you're choosing. You're also going to need to think about the soil volume that will be required to allow the plant to thrive. Some plants require a lot more soil and nutrients than you may imagine. So making sure that that container does have enough space to accommodate the roots and the necessary soil volume is important. We're going to have some tips, especially for vegetable gardening, in a subsequent slide that will give you some guidance in terms of the size of the pots that you're going to be wanting to choose. You should remember that some plants, like indeterminate tomatoes, I'm a big tomato guy. I remember that Annette mentioned that a couple folks also are growing tomatoes in containers, can become very top heavy. So when you're thinking about selecting the right kind of plant, not only should you be thinking about installing the vertical supports like bamboo canes or tomato cages to make sure that you're supporting the above ground portion of that plant, but just remember that in some places, if you are experiencing high winds or if you have squirrels in your backyard that like to climb up your plants, you need to make sure that the container is weighty enough to stay upright. The worst thing is going back into your backyard after a windstorm and having to clean up all these pots that tipped over. So making sure that you have a weighty enough pot to support that is important. Another really important thing to consider is drainage. If your pot does not have a drainage hole, you're going to have water management problems in your pot. Soggy roots are no bueno for most plants, and your container will not succeed without drainage. You also want to be sure that you're keeping the soil in the pot. So using a mesh or coffee filter to retain the soil in the pot over that drainage hole is always a great idea. Just a quick note, if you find a pot that you just love, it's going to be appropriate for the size of the plant, but it doesn't have a hole, you can drill holes in many types of containers using specialized drill bits. There's lots of really good guidance online in terms of how to do that. Finally, you're going to want to pick a container that's made from materials that are appropriate to the needs of your particular plant. There are many types of materials that manufacturers use to construct plants, from terracotta and clay, stone, plastic, felt, metal. There's many, many types here. There are pros and cons to each type, specific to what kind of plant you're going to be growing. And so you want to make sure that you're choosing the right type of material for that pot in order for your plant to thrive. So let's talk a little bit more about some non-negotiables for pot selection. Starting with drainage. Again, drainage. This is important. See these little terracotta pots? They've got those handy holes in the bottom. You want to see this in any pot that you have. This is a requirement. You also want to avoid placing fillers that prevent free drainage in the bottom of your pot. It's a common practice for some to place a smaller pot inside the larger pot upside down to encourage that draining. We don't recommend that. That reduces the amount of grow space in the pot and can cause other issues we'll talk about a little bit later in terms of water. When it comes to drainage as well, you need to be watching out for standing water in terms of saucers. If you're going to put a saucer underneath one of your pots, that will hold a lot of excess water if it's raining, and it's not going to allow that plant to drain effectively. Standing water is a place where mosquitoes can breed, so we want to avoid standing water in saucers as possible. We're going to talk a little bit more about mitigating that on a subsequent slide. The color of your containers can also have an impact on the growth of your plant. Smaller plants and darker colored containers will absorb more heat more quickly, which can lead to root damage for some sensitive plants. So just be aware of the color and the size of the plant in terms of the sensitivity of the roots. The porosity of your container material is also important. If you're potting something that's in clay, ceramic, concrete, wood, or fabric, like a felt grow bag, these are going to dry out a lot more quickly than other types like plastic or metal. When we say porosity, this really refers to the ability of air and water to move through that material through tiny pores and spaces in the containers. Plastic is very impermeable. It's not going to allow for much porosity. But if the material is porous, again, it will potentially absorb the water, Terracotta pots, for instance, will definitely absorb water. So if you're not watering enough in that sort of situation, that terracotta pot may take some of the water that is required for your roots and potentially dry out the roots. So just remember that if you're working with a porous pot, you may need to water more frequently and monitor it for dryness more frequently than you would for some other types of pots. Of course, there are some plants that really do like to grow in drier root conditions. Many herbs fit this bill. Many cacti and succulents also love to live in a terracotta pot. So porous pots aren't bad. It just means that you're going to have to treat them a little bit differently than some others. Size is another important consideration. The container size is really crucial for you to think about when you're selecting pots for your plant. You need to think about the horizontal and vertical root growth as well. So it's not just talking about the vertical, the depth of the roots, but some roots do spread out. We'll talk about that a little bit more in the next slide. If you are considering putting multiple plants in one pot, you're also going to be needing to consider the size of the pot for appropriateness for the multiple number of plants that you're putting in there. You should also be making sure that when you are grouping plants in one container, that you're using plants with similar cultural needs. So putting plants that have similar light needs or watering needs in the same plot. You really want to think about the growing conditions that are required for your plant before you group them into a same pot. In other words, you don't want to be planting your cactus with a cucumber because they have completely different growing needs. So let's just avoid that. Also, just a note in here in terms of the size of the planters. If you get to a certain size, these plant pots can become very, very heavy, especially when they're wet. So it's always a great bet to put larger pots on a dolly or something with wheels so that you can move them around if necessary. So let's talk a little bit more about root size. The size of the root system, of course, will directly impact the size of the plant. If a plant is not able to grow its root system to the extent that it naturally would in nature, the net effect will be a smaller plant, likely with less production. Let's take, for an example, this cucumber plant that I'm coming back to time and again in today's conversation and look at the growth habit of the roots. A cucumber plant does have a taproot. It can go up to 4 feet down into the soil. However, their lateral roots also extend sideways horizontally up to 2 feet away from the center stem of that plant. Those lateral roots do grow within the top around 8 inches of the soil and are really important for that plant in terms of bringing in water and nutrients for it to grow. Cucumbers are a very large plant, which require this amount of root space to anchor themselves and to, again, maximize that water uptake and to pull in more nutrients for the soil. For a vining plant like a cucumber, you'll also need to think about the infrastructure for the vining element on the top, or else they will take over your yard very quickly, especially if you're in a small space. You compare a cucumber to an onion here on the right, and you can see that the growth habit of the roots is very different. You know, onions have a more compact root spread in terms of a horizontal spread, about as deep or maybe not quite as deep as the cucumber. But again, this is just an illustration that when you're thinking about the size of the container you're going to be buying for your plant, do a little bit of research in terms of what that root structure is going to look like for that plant to succeed. There is a rule of thumb here that if you double the pot size, like if you're upgrading on a pot for medium and deep-rooted plants, doubling the pot size will generally facilitate 43% larger vegetable plants. So it's not necessarily a 1-to-1 ratio, but if you increase the size of the pot, you'll be allowing for additional root space and your plant will be able to succeed a little bit more. Just when you're thinking about planning for your container garden, again, you want to think about the soil volume here as well, especially when you think about how much potting mix or other type of growing media you're getting to buy to fill up that container. It can become very expensive. So you want to calculate the soil volume that's necessary. This is a cubic measurement. You can do this online. Google will do this for you if you'd like, but you can basically calculate it by multiplying the height, depth, and width of your planting space. So height times depth times width will equal the cubic inches required for that plant. And then you can divide that to come up with the cubic foot measurement. Bags of potting mix will let you know the amount of soil volume that's in them. You can do those conversions online as well to aid in that planning effort. So let's talk a little bit more about pot material and dive in here into 6 different types of pot material that people use frequently on this and the next slide. So again, clay and terracotta, very porous material. They do increase airflow to the roots, which is great for a lot of plants that do like drier or more airy environments for their roots. This can also deter fungal growth. So if you have issues in your yard with moisture, maybe a clay pot would be something that you could try and employ, as they do tend to dry out more quickly. Again, drier loving pots like herbs and succulents would do well in a clay pot. You're talking about your lavender, your thyme, your sage, cactus, anything like that will really thrive in a clay pot. Plastic pots. And one of the big advantages of the plastic pots is that they come in a really wide array of designs that are available to meet your aesthetic needs. They're oftentimes more affordable than some options. They do retain water very, very well. So you're going to want to select plants that thrive in moist soil if you're going to be putting them into a plastic pot. There is almost no porosity in terms of plastic. So that water that goes in there is going to stay in there unless the plant is using it or it's draining from the bottom. So you definitely want to make sure that your drainage holes are there in these plastic pots, because again, if that water gets stuck in there, you're going to be encountering root rot situations, which is definitely not something that you want. You also might want to be monitoring the holes for blockages in plastic plants as well. I had an unfortunate instance last year where I lost some herbs in a plant container where the drainage hole became plugged up, and I had not monitored it sufficiently, and I had to repot the entire thing. So trust me, make sure that your drainage is on point in terms of these plastic planters. Another advantage of some of these plastic pots is that you can potentially find recyclable ones, and they're also lighter weight. There's really great plastic planters that you can use for deck railings, for instance, that probably wouldn't be good if you used a clay or metal pot, right? Too heavy for that particular application. So plastic can be a great choice for some plants and situations. Metal pots are popular for many people. That galvanized bucket that you see there has a little bit of a country vibe. It definitely vibes with my background. It's attractive to me. You should know, though, that metal does absorb and intensify heat. So that means that when you are using metal containers, you're going to want to use plants in there that are going to be okay with that sort of growing condition. Tropical plants, palms, plants that you bring on your house plants may be okay with this sort of situation. Sun-loving perennials, warm season grasses, sun-loving vegetables would be okay in metal pots, but not many other types of plants would appreciate that kind of heat. You should also note that metal pots and containers are potentially susceptible to rust. Even galvanized containers can rust over time. You can find coated metal containers that can help to ward off that rust over time, but even those can be susceptible, like in the screw holes or something like that. There's chinks in the armor that the rust can get into, so you may find yourself needing to replace these more frequently than, say, a plastic pot potentially. Also, some metal pots can be relatively pricey, so it may not be as affordable as some other types. Three other types I'd like to highlight here. Self-watering plants are very popular. The pot with the green trellis on the top is an example of a self-watering plant. They work with a reservoir in the base of the pot that allows water to wick up into the soil as it dries out, which is great if you're going on vacation or just an infrequent waterer. Maybe you're forgetting. Self-watering planters may be an option for you. Most of these types of planters will function for about 2 to 3 weeks without a watering, but it depends on the humidity level, the wind, how big your plant is. If you have a giant tomato, an indeterminate tomato growing out of this, it's going to suck up a lot more water. So it's not necessarily a set and forget. You're still going to need to monitor these self-watering planters to make sure that they're not drying out. You will also need to avoid using liquid fertilizer in these applications, because those fertilizers and salts can and will accumulate in the water reservoir in the bottom of the planter, which may harm your plant. So we recommend using a granular fertilizer worked into the soil. Slow release one is ideal for this situation to avoid that heavy salt content. You'll also want to monitor the bottom there for mosquitoes. It's really recommended to put in mosquito bits or mosquito dunks to ward off those larvae. This was a lesson I learned with some tomato self-watering planters several years ago. We had a mosquito apocalypse in our backyard, and were able to figure out that it was the self-watering planters that were the culprit there. Self-watering pots are really great for things like tomatoes, basil, squash, and broccoli that like consistently moist soil. Grow bags, like the ones in the bottom picture there, this is a picture from my backyard, are a popular way to grow your container gardening these days. There are some pros and cons to these particular types of pots that are generally made out of like felt or other fabric-like material. Because they are highly porous, they do encourage healthy oxygen transfer for your roots, meaning the roots will air prune. They'll sense the oxygen coming in from the side and they will sort of stop growing. If you have ever grown a plant in a plastic container and repotted potted it and seen the roots growing around and around in circles. That will not happen in a grow bag situation, which is great. Obviously, these sorts of materials are great for drainage. They're also very easy to store. If you empty them out in the winter, you can wash them out and fold them up, put them in a space bag or your garage or something like that. Pretty easy to store. There are cons for these types of applications, durability being one of them. Fabric is not quite as durable as some other materials, so generally these will only last 2 to 3 growing seasons. The cost increases as well because of the replacement frequency. Aesthetically, they're not necessarily decorative. They're not the prettiest planters that you could possibly put out there. They, of course, dry out very quickly. So if you are growing plants that require a lot of moisture, they may not be the best thing for you. So they're going to require a lot of watering depending on the plant that you have in there. Mobility can also be a factor. There's 2 sizes of felt pots in this picture that you see, a real small one in the front that I was growing some miniature peppers in. Those are easy to move around. The handles may snap off. They're not necessarily as durable as some others. That big container in the back with the PVC pipe structures was impossible to move. I don't have this container any longer. Just know that mobility can really be a challenge with these, and it's not as easy to adhere some wheels to the bottom of these as well. One final note on this type of planting material, they are susceptible to rodent damage. I had several mice or squirrels or something chewing through the sides of these bags and getting into the roots and stealing my potatoes. So just a word to the wise in terms of that. The last one I'll talk about here are biocontainers. An example of one of those is on the upper left-hand corner of this slide. These are generally plantable containers. You can start your seedlings indoors and then plop this thing right into your garden bed outside if that's the way you want to do it. They're compostable. They'll break down in the soil over time, which is great. However, some of these planters can be made out of peat. Peat is a non-renewable resource, so if you are going to be choosing a biocontainer, try to choose one that's made out of a different type of material like coco coir instead. That would be more environmentally sustainable. So on the next slide after this, I'm going to be talking a little bit about growing medium, but I'll pause here and see if Annette has any good questions for me so far.
We have a few different questions about pots. Starting out, Janelle was asking about Home Depot buckets. She said she gardens in Home Depot buckets, and she's curious about whether or not she needs to worry about BHP uptake, I guess, into vegetables or edibles.
I have not heard that that's a necessarily an issue with the buckets. I know that's a big trend. I know I have a friend who grows a lot of tomatoes in those sorts of buckets. If it's a concern of yours, I would do a little bit of desktop research. I'm not necessarily an expert on that topic, but from what I understand, the current conversation is that that's less of a concern than it had been in the past.
Also, Candace would like to know what plants thrive in plastic pots, specifically in that moisture heavy environment.
Yeah, so you're going to be wanting to plant in your plastic plots. A lot of ornamentals will do well in that kind of environment. Plants that like to sit in moist soils. I had a pot that had some cannas in it for a while. They did really well. They're from swampy environments. They like that moist soil. A real key for folks to know, and I'll talk about this more on a subsequent slide, is you really should know the cultural needs of your individual plant. So if you're thinking about growing something, there's a lot of great resources online. You can check out the extension office resources as well for those, but tropical style plants will be great in there. Tomatoes do well. If you're thinking about vegetables, tomatoes, cucumbers, these things do well in those plastic containers because they do like that moist soil. You probably wouldn't want to be using like herbs or something in there. So those are some good ideas for you to try.
Okay, just a couple more questions before we move on. Lorraine had a question about glazed versus unglazed ceramic or clay pots and whether or not they can support the same types of plants or what consideration
Right.
that has an impact on.
Yes, the glazing, if you have a glazed terracotta pot, it will impact the porosity of the pot. It is still more porous than a plastic pot per se, but it will retain more moisture than just an unglazed terracotta pot. So if you're growing a cactus, for instance, that really likes its soil to be dried out, I would stick with an unglazed pot versus the glazing. I will also note that some glazed pots do not fare very well over the winter due to the freeze and thaw cycle. That glazing on the outside can crack and fall off. I had several lovely Mexican style Talavera glazed terracotta pots. I left them out over winter one time, left them on the ground in some freezing water. And when I came back in the spring, all of the glazing had come off of the bottom of that pot and they just weren't real pretty anymore. So just be aware of some limitations when it comes to the glazing. However, there are some absolutely gorgeous glazed pot options out there. So I definitely understand the aesthetic appeal.
Okay. One other person did offer that their experience with plastic pots is that they find that they break down after about 3 years. They have a limited lifespan. So
Yeah.
just a little of,
With with the plastic pots, you got to be considering the thickness of that plastic layer as well. Really thin plastic pots, like a nursery, like a black nursery pot or something, is not going to hold up as well to punctures and things like that. They will go downhill more quickly. Also, if you have a colored plastic planter, like if you buy one that's a terracotta colored, that will fade over time in the sun, probably look a little less aesthetically pleasing. You can renovate those sorts of plastic pots over time. I have spray painted old plastic pots that looked a little bit faded over the years, and that's been good for me. But yes, the durability of plastic will vary depending on the material used, the thickness, and the shape and format generally.
right.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit more here about growing medium. This is really the stuff that you're putting into your pot for the roots to grow within. The headline here is that you want to be choosing packaged potting mix or some sort of growing medium that's appropriate for your particular plant to encourage its health and vitality over time. It's important to know too that when you buy a bag of potting mix or potting soil, it likely already has added fertilizers put into it. We're going to talk a lot more about fertilization needs in a couple of slides here, but you do want to read those ingredients in the potting mixes that you are considering to make sure that you're finding the right mix for the plant that you are going to be growing in that particular container. You're going to be paying attention to the nutrient percentages of that fertilizing mix that's in that bag. Again, we're going to talk a little bit more about this later, but in a very quick fashion, that fertilizer usually contains NPK is what you're going to see on the bag. That stands for nitrogen, phosphorus, and the K actually stands for potassium. That's the periodic table of elements symbol for potassium. In short, nitrogen promotes leaf growth and green color. Phosphorus promotes flowering and fruiting, new roots and seeds. It helps to fight diseases. Potassium promotes growth rate and strong stems. But generally speaking, if you're looking at especially like an ornamental flower arrangement in your container, finding a balance of these three nutrients is best. So when you buy that potting soil, look for one that has relatively similar numbers. It'll show up like 20, 20, 20. That means it's 20% nitrogen, 20% phosphorus, 20% potassium. That's a nice balanced mix for some of your general purpose plants. But also keep in mind that since there's already fertilizers added into these potting mixes in most cases, you're not going to need to fertilize it for the first little while. So it's a good rule of thumb to wait at least 6 weeks, maybe up to 8 weeks before you're applying additional fertilizing to your container gardens. It's important to remember too that rain and watering does wash the nutrients out of your containers over time. So after that initial bit of fertilizer that's in the soil has been washed out, you're going to need to supplement those nutrients in the pot with fertilization to continue to encourage healthy plant growth. I will just note, if you have compost, use it. That's a really great way to add nutrients into your container garden. All plants love that compost mix put into there. So if you got it, definitely throw it in your pots. Let's dive a little bit more into best bets for your growing medium. Again, you want to research the soil requirements of your particular plant in order to determine what type of soil medium you're going to be wanting to put in there. Prepackaged growing medium is appropriate for most plants. Most plants will appreciate that potting mix that you'll find at the big box store. It's light, it's fluffy enough to facilitate air and water into the roots, but also weighty enough to support the weight of the plant as it grows over time. Just note that you do want to make sure that you're adding enough soil, leaving maybe an inch or two on the top free of soil in your container to avoid runoff if you have a heavy rainstorm, for instance. And if you pot that soil right up to the lip of that container, you're going to be losing some of that soil out of the plant. You should keep in mind too that some plants have very specific needs in terms of the soil. Taking, for example, azaleas. If you have an azalea that you're hoping to grow in a container, azaleas require more acidic soil in terms of the pH level than many other types of plants. pH levels can also be a concern for people who are trying to encourage a particular color in their hydrangeas. Most commercially available potting mixes are not coming with a high acidity level, but there are specialty potting mixes that you can buy for acid-loving plants or whatever type of particular amendment that your plant that you're hoping to grow will require. You can do some research. Maybe they'll have it at your big box store. Maybe you'll have to order it online. Try to understand the needs of your particular plant before you purchase that mix, or you can use regular potting mix rocks or soil that you can amend with other things to change that pH level. So again, taking, for example, an azalea, you can change the acidity of that soil mix by adding things like ferrous sulfate, ammonium sulfate, or other organic ways to change the pH level of that soil to make sure that it is going to be a good environment for that plant. But again, you're going to want to make sure that any plants you put in there will have that same requirement. So put other acidic loving plants in that container with that azalea. There are soilless mixes out there that are primarily made of things like core, perlite, or vermiculite. Just to note that these sorts of soils do not contain any nutrients. These mixes are sterile with no good bacteria or mycorrhizal fungi that promote root growth in your plants. That's found in real soil. These are not available in soilless mixes, so they're not appropriate for many types of plantings. They're great for annual plantings. If you're just putting out some marigolds or something like that, or if you're having house plants that you're putting outside, cacti, succulents, these are better for soilless mixes than others, especially garden vegetables are not going to do well in a soilless mix. Garden soil, buying a bag of garden soil from the big box store or just taking it out of the ground in your property if you have it, is not recommended for container gardening. It has the potential to introduce diseases and pests into your container that you don't want. Also, it's thicker in terms of consistency than most potting mixes and isn't going to drain as well as you probably want in those container gardening applications. A question we get a lot in terms of potting mix with containers is, can I reuse the old potting mix or should I be throwing this away? You can absolutely reuse old potting mix. Remember though that old potting mix will probably be flushed of the nutrients that your plants may require. So if you are going to be reusing old potting mix, it's recommended that, in your new container, you maybe put 2/3 of it with the reused soil and 1/3 compost or brand new potting mix, or adding supplemental nutrients to make sure that you're reinvigorating that old potting mix. Also, quick note, if you have an issue with a plant as a virus or some sort of nasty bacteria or something like that, you have a sick plant that may be coming from soil-borne pathogens, that is not potting mix that you should be reusing. You should be throwing that away. Just a little bit more here in terms of the difference between soil and soilless potting mixes. Again, soil-based mixes contain generally sterilized garden loam with additives like peat, sand, bark, vermiculite, or perlite. These do contain nutrients as opposed to those soilless mixes that do not. Here are 3 types of ingredients that are oftentimes used in soilless mixes. Peat moss is one of them. Peat moss is a non-renewable resource, and increasingly gardeners are trying to pivot away from the use of peat moss in the garden. Peat moss is harvested from peat bogs out in nature. Canada and Ireland are some places that a lot of this comes from. Peat grows and generates very, very slowly. It's only about a millimeter a year of growth for peat moss. And so if you think about 1 meter's worth of peat moss on the top of the surface of that peat bog, that took 1,000 years to generate. We're burning through peat moss at an alarming rate. So there are other more sustainable ways of supplementing your soil than peat. So if you can find peat-free compost or potting mixes, that would be definitely something to consider. Vermiculite retains more water for longer periods of time, but has less aeration than perlite, which retains less water but drains more efficiently with better aeration. So just keep that in mind. If you're using pure vermiculite, it's going to compress a little bit. It's almost more like rocks, versus perlite. When you kind of hold it in your hand, it almost feels like styrofoam. So these are definitely interesting things to use, but again, probably not the best for your tropical foliage plants or garden vegetables. So let's talk a little bit about watering here. The most common growth problem that container plants have relates to either too much or too little water. So the pictures that are here on the slide are illustrating the famous finger test. So if you're worried about whether or not your container needs to be watered, you can always use the finger test. You insert your finger into the soil up to that second knuckle. Okay, not just the first one, but the second one. If the soil is dry all the way down your finger, that means it's probably time to water this plant. So you're going to water it deeply without waterlogging the container. Of course, you don't want the water to be spilling out the top, but you do want to soak it thoroughly. During summer heat waves, or if it's a really windy part of the year, you may want to check your pots more frequently than if it's been raining recently. But besides the finger test, if that's just not appealing to you, there are also commercially available water meters that you can use that has a probe that you can put right into the plant that will indicate whether it's ready to water or not. And certain types of materials like plastic pots, they're going to be holding onto that water a little longer. You may not need to test quite as often. With clay or other porous type pots, you're going to be checking for watering needs more frequently. There is a right way and a wrong way to water. You should be aiming, as the infographic on the right here indicates, for less frequent, heavier watering. The reason for this is that deeper watering really does encourage your roots to grow towards the bottom of the plant. And if you have a larger root ball for your plant, it's going to mean a more healthy, vigorous, larger plant above the soil. If you're just watering a little bit, more frequently, like the example shows on the top, you're really encouraging your plant's roots to stay pretty shallow. So when we are watering, you do want to water deeply, less frequently when the pot needs it. It's important to note that plants take in oxygen and moisture through small openings in their leaves called stomata. These little pores really matter in terms of your watering approach because these pores are really generally open during the day to absorb CO2 for photosynthesis and to take in water. But during high temperature periods, droughts, and at night, they close up to preserve that water. So what does this mean for you? It means that if you water at night, or during the hottest, nastiest, driest part of the day in the summer heat, the stomata are going to be closed. And so that means that the water that accumulates on the top of the leaves will stay on that leaf for longer than if you're irrigating at other times of the day, which could potentially cause some fungal problems. This has been a persistent issue for me with my tomato collection in the summer, and it's been a lesson learned for me that irrigating earlier in the morning is the best time to water your outdoor containers, and this is to minimize evaporation loss, minimize the effects of wind, and reduce leaf wetness that again can promote fungal diseases. You do want to apply the water towards the roots rather than the leaves. If you can see the drain hole on the bottom, watering until you see some of that water coming out the drain hole will indicate to you that you have watered it to a sufficient point that you're going to basically encouraging those roots to chase to the bottom of the pot. We do want to avoid standing or soggy water on the top of your plant or in the saucers. So again, saucers underneath your plants with a drainage hole can create standing pools of water that can contribute to that root rot. So you want to empty out those saucers regularly if you're going to use them. That's going to be a lot easier with a small pot versus a big one. So we do recommend especially for larger pots, consider using pot feet. These little terracotta doohickeys on the bottom of the slide are examples of pot feet. You just slide these underneath the pot. It gets the pot up off of the ground and prevents some of that pot sitting in standing water. Okay. Some other great things to consider could be using a little bit of a mulch layer on the top of your pot to preserve moisture, especially if you're maybe thinking about some crops that require more moisture versus less. Mulching on the top can help that plant from drying out a little bit. There are some commercially available polymer things. They look like little globby clear things that manufacturers have been marketing to mix into the soil that are supposedly there to absorb moisture and release them slowly over time. Research has shown that they have limited benefits and they are quite expensive in some cases, so it's not necessarily recommended to use those. Finally, in terms of watering, if you're on the top of a hill, or you're in a very windy space, your containers will dry out more quickly. If you have hanging baskets that are exposed to the air in many ways, more than some other containers, they're also going to dry out very quickly. So you may want to use windbreaks or screens to avoid that desiccation that could happen, as well as soil and leaf scorching. So let's talk a little bit more about fertilizer. Really just want to emphasize again that container plants do need fertilization. They are in a self-contained environment that doesn't necessarily generate these nutrients that you're going to need over time. Again, newly purchased potting mixes do have these added nutrients. Again, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium there. Each one of them does supplement different types of the growth habit of your plant. A general rule of thumb is that for flowering or fruiting plants, a higher phosphorus rating is needed for them to develop those flowers and fruits. For vegetables as well, you may want to consider a slow release fertilizer that does have additional calcium or magnesium added in there. You want to follow the instructions and the labels on these fertilizers and soils to make sure that you're selecting the right type of fertilizer for your particular needs. If you do not have a sense that the plant that you're trying to grow in that container needs one type of nutrient over another, it's a safe bet to use a balanced NPK rating, like a 10-10-10 or a 15-15-15. The fertilizer label that's here in the example is a 4600, which means that this is basically a nuclear bomb of nitrogen. There's a lot of nitrogen in this fertilizer, but no phosphorus or potassium. That's the order in which these numbers are put on these bags of fertilizer. So this is an example of a non-balanced fertilizer. So just remember that you should be researching this before you put the fertilizer in. Essential nutrients are flushed from the container during watering, which is again part of the reason why you're going to need to frequently with container gardens. However, slow release fertilizers, granular ones that you can mix into the soil, are very helpful in terms of slowly meeting out that fertilizer over time and helping your plant to succeed. Again, very important for self-watering containers. You do want to monitor your container garden plants for signs of nutrient deficiency, such as leaf yellowing or browning, stunted growth, and poor flowering or fruiting. These could be signs that you need to put a little more fertilizer into your container. There are a wide variety of organic fertilizers that you can also consider when you're looking to amend or supplement the nutrients in the soil in your container. Some examples include bone meal, which is rich in phosphorus and calcium. This is great for many crops like carrots and beets, potatoes, and other root crops, which require those nutrients in order to thrive and grow good vegetables for you. Blood meal is very rich in nitrogen. It produces a lot of additional growth for some of your brassicas. Those crops include broccoli, cauliflower, kale, Brussels sprouts, cabbage, and the like. This is also a great amendment or a spring feeding for alliums. So we're talking about the garlic and onion family. And then finally, fish emulsion, which I use in my yard a lot, is very high in nitrogen. This is really great for leafy green veggies. I tend to use them a lot early in the spring to promote that early growth so you get healthy plants before the summer months hit. But just a note here that fish emulsion does have a little bit of a scent. So just be aware of that before you put it into your yard. Also, just be sure that you're not over fertilizing your plant. You want to follow the product recommendations on the bag of the fertilizer to make sure you're not doing that. Some of the signs of over-fertilization are leaf yellowing, lower leaf wilt, browning leaf margins and tips, rotted roots, leaf drop, and fertilizer crusts on the top of the soil. If you see a lot of salts accumulating on the top, that might be an indication that you're over fertilizing. Or if you see that your plant is just refusing to grow, that might be because there is too much fertilizer in there and sort of locking out some of the other nutrients that it needs to grow and to thrive. So the slide after this, we're going to talk about container placement and great locations for your containers, but I'll pause here again and see if there's any good questions for us, Annette.
Okay, Ben. Yes, we do have some questions. I think that you did address one about reusing soil. That question had specifically to do with a raised standing vegetable planter. Any additional information on whether or not there's any problem with reusing soil year after year in a standing planter like that?
No, you can reuse the soil. Again, if you're amending it with additional nutrients, putting in the compost, there shouldn't be a concern in terms of that.
Okay. Alexander asked if you can add wood ash in addition to compost to your growing medium.
You can. You're going to need to make sure that you're researching the nutrients that that wood ash is going to be imparting into your soil and making sure that that is appropriate for the plants that you have in the pot.
Marcia asked if she said she has two outdoor compost bins and she wanted to know if it's okay to use that compost in her containers.
Yes, absolutely. I have a compost bin as well. It's some of the best nutrients that you can add into your plant. If you got it, definitely use it.
And Elizabeth had a question about using coconut coir instead of peat as a growing medium. She wanted to know if she needed to add anything to that to use it instead of peat.
Well, remember, coco coir does not have nutrients in it. So if you're going to be using that as a growing medium, you're going to need to make sure that it's right for the type of plant that you're going to be growing and amending that with any other sorts of fertilizer or nutrient that's required. It's not going to be appropriate for a lot of situations. Coco coir, also, if you see the hanging basket liners, that's coco coir. It's a byproduct of the agricultural industry with coconuts. So it is very sustainable, but again, does not really impart many nutrients for your plants.
Okay. Couple more questions. Tammy wants to know if there are vegan fertilizer options.
That is a good question. I think we'll have to get back in touch with you on that.
Molly would like to know how you recommend using mystery compost from the farmer's market. Could you use it in a liquid instead of the soil?
Mystery compost is another one that's new to me. So I think that's another one we'll have to get back to you on that one. Sorry about that.
Right. Janelle's question is it common that organic gardening without pesticides and insecticides that plants grow slower?
No, not necessarily. Pesticides can be a very problematic thing in a container because they can accumulate over time and actually can inhibit the growth of your plant. In fact, in a couple of slides, we're going to be talking about the fact that if, in a lot of container situations, the recommendation is to use mechanical pest removal, like actually picking those caterpillars off of the plant rather than putting those chemicals into your container.
Okay, and one other, I think in response to the question about vegan fertilizer, one person suggested alfalfa meal as a replacement for blood meal. Do you have any experience with alfalfa?
Absolutely. I use alfalfa pellets in my garden containers a lot, especially for my vegetables. Definitely imparts a nice little bit of nitrogen. They break down in the rain and the wetness. They kind of look almost like breakfast cereal when they break down, but they can be a good additive for your garden. So that's a good suggestion for a vegan alternative.
Okay, and someone else suggested seaweed fertilizers as well.
Right. All right. So let's
Okay.
talk a little bit about the placement of containers. The site location that you choose is going to have a big impact on the success of your plant. All sites have pros and cons. So when you're planning for your container garden, you have to pay attention to things like light, water, and microclimates. In terms of light, you're going to want to do some research into the light conditions of your particular site. Does your site face north, south, east, or west? A good thing to practice is actually mapping the sunlight over the day to determine the light availability in your particular situation. When you are mapping the sunlight, you want to determine if you have full sun, meaning 6 to 8 hours of direct sunlight a day. Part sun is 4 to 6 hours, part shade is 2 to 4 hours, and full shade is 0 to 2 hours. Generally speaking, if you don't have an obstructed view, facing east is going to give you 4 to 5 hours of direct sun, west is 5 to 6, south is 6 to 8, and north is less than 4. Of course, you want to consider things like shade from surrounding buildings. This light information is probably one of the most important things you're going to have to take into consideration in terms of placing the container and making sure you're selecting the right plant that's going to thrive in that environment. Remembering that light, especially when it comes to metal containers, that can influence the heat in that container and can have a negative impact on your plant. Water access and potential for damage is something to consider as well. If you're hanging up a hanging basket, if you have mobility issues, just consider that you're going to have to water this over time. So maybe keep it within reach. You can consider things like self-watering pots or automatic irrigation systems. Remember, you're going to have to water hanging baskets more often. And also remember that these sorts of hanging baskets do drip down. They could damage your patio surface, for instance, if they've left over time. You want to secure them very well to make sure that they're not going to drop down and injure anybody. They have to be securely hung. Also remembering that if you are in an apartment situation, the water implications for the people that live below you is something important to consider. You don't want to drown them with your water runoff from your container garden. Microclimates is something that's really important to discuss as well. If you're not familiar with the term, a microclimate is the climate of a small or restricted area that differs from the climate of the surrounding area. So as an example, in my back patio, I have a south-facing patio, luckily enough, with brick walls surrounding it that absorb heat. So it's generally a few degrees warmer than the general area around me, which means that I can grow some plants a little bit earlier in the growing season, grow some plants that may require warmer temperatures, but it also means that there's some plants that I can't grow back there because it's just too dang hot sometimes. Balconies, patios, and decks are all really subject to the microclimate impact. If your site is enclosed with brick, stone, concrete, glass, or metal, you should be considering the impact that these different materials will have on your microclimate. Brick and stone and concrete will absorb heat during the day and emit radiant heat at night, keeping the nighttime temperature somewhat warmer. Glass and metal reflect light and heat at night, so it will be cooler. And also you want to consider the wind in your particular microclimate. If you're on the top of Arlington Ridge, for instance, you're going to have a very windy environment. It's going to be a little bit cooler. So just consider that as a part of your microclimate considerations. Also, in terms of placement in containers, if you live in a place that is restricted by HOA rules, you want to make sure that you're following those rules. You don't want to run afoul of any condo boards or anything like that. Also, just a quick note here that heavy, large pots may not be appropriate for some decks and patios. But there are lots of sites that you can really leverage to use those microclimates to your advantage. Patios, driveways, balconies, and decks. Again, there's lots of microclimate situations that are coming in here, but you do want to monitor them. So if you have a large deck, for example, one side may be sunnier, one side may be shadier. You're going to want to pick plants and containers that are appropriate to those microclimates on those situations. Covered patios and balconies and spots under the eaves of your roof do provide additional shelter from frost. If you are located at the bottom of a slope or a hill, remember that cold air does flow downward, so that could have an impact on your microclimate as well. It's also a great idea to plant native flowers or small shrubs that can bring in pollinators and beneficial insects to your particular site, regardless of the microclimate. However, just note that the higher your site location is, if you're up on top of a hill, the less likely it is that pollinators will be visiting you. So you may need to employ some additional methods to ensure that your crops are getting pollinated and that you are getting those yields out of your plants. So some best bets to consider around site location. Again, site restrictions, thinking about the weight, the damage that that pot may impart on your deck or patio, thinking about pollinator access, avoiding large clay or ceramic pots on balconies, water access, making sure that your hose gets to all those pots. If not, consider that drip irrigation system. Do you have a watering bucket or a can that's you're not going to have to refill 40 times in order to get your whole garden watered? Plant caddies, mobility of your plant, moving it around during the season to maximize the amount of sun that it's getting. This is something that's good to consider. Grouping your pots with similar cultural needs so that you are really leveraging little mini ecosystem there and not putting a plant in the wrong spot with some plants that is not going to necessarily enjoy the same conditions. A reminder that wind does contribute to drying out, so you're going to be needing to water those plants more often. Consider the radiant heat from your surrounding environments when you're thinking about your particular microclimate. Also, this great tomato trellis here, you should be considering vertical structures to save space, especially if you're talking about a patio or a deck where you probably don't just want to have plants out there. You might want to exist in nature as well. You don't want your tomato sprawling all over the place, so think vertically as well. Probably the biggest thing to keep in mind in terms of this is spending good money on quality potting mix is a very good thing to consider. That good potting mix is going to impart great health for your plant for quite some time. So invest wisely. And also think about planning for the optimum care of your plant. The bottom line here is that in caring responsibly for container plants, it's incumbent upon you to know what those plants need in order to survive. This means paying attention to both the above soil and below soil conditions, the site environment that they're planted in, and any common health issues that those plants may encounter, like insects and diseases. As a general rule of thumb, many container planting situations have fewer health issues than some others, but they are not immune. So for instance, if you are growing tomatoes out there, you should be aware of what diseases they are susceptible to, including like tomato hornworms. This is something that everybody just needs to know. We talked a little bit previously about pesticides in containers, not necessarily the best way to go. Mechanical solutions like hand removing or hosing off aphids off of your plant is often a better way to manage pests in a container gardening situation, or you can import some beneficial insects like ladybugs to let them do their jobs. Although just know if you release a bunch of ladybugs, they're probably going to stick around in your yard for about 15 minutes and then fly away. So their impact over time may not be as much as you hope. A note here too that fungal problems in containers cannot be solved by a fungicide alone. Fungicides are preventative primarily, and pesticides are definitely to be considered as a last resort in containers. So if you do see fungal issues, you want to be checking in on your watering methodology, removing diseased or bacteria-ridden leaves early to prevent the spread of those conditions in your container garden. And then also just remember that one of the advantages of container gardening is portability. So if you can move the pots around so that they can enjoy their optimal grow conditions, you should do that. But if there's one thing that we want you to walk away with is that you should know your plant and know what it's going to take for them to survive in this particular situation. Starting with plant selection, selecting the right plants for that pot is going to be important for you to consider. Again, you're going to want to take into consideration the size of the root ball in order to make sure that the container is going to be the right size. There are lots of edible flowers that you could put into plants as well. So mixing up edibles with ornamentals is always a great thing to consider when you're thinking about your container gardens. You can also research miniature or dwarf varieties of some of your favorite plants that may be more appropriate for the size of the container that you have. For me, as a tomato lover, I have definitely found some really great success with some dwarf tomato varieties like Tiny Tim or Firebird Sweet or Rosella Crimson that grow more in a more compact fashion and are going to be more appropriate for smaller containers. In terms of the design of your plant, especially for ornamentals, there's this great rule of thumb out there. You can choose a thriller, a filler, and a spiller. So this picture here on the left is an example of a garden design that incorporates this methodology. The thriller is that spiky middle plant. That's a tall plant that draws immediate visual interest to you. The filler is that round mounding plant. I see a couple maybe calibrachoas in there that are forming the bulk of the center of that planting. And then there's the spiller, those little plants that do come down off of the side and add additional visual interest. Just be aware that if you are going to be using a spiller that is an invasive plant, that might spill into the rest of your garden. So probably steer clear from invasive plants just in general, but also within this particular context. So some advice here for some particular types of vegetables and edibles for specific sizes of containers. So shallow rooted vegetables, there's a good list here A lot of these vegetables are appropriate for containers that are about 12 inches wide, 12 inches deep, 12 by 12 by 12, basically 1 cubic foot. Lots of really great shallow rooted vegetables you can grow in a pot this size. A lot of leafy greens, arugula. Just be sure to harvest them before it gets too hot. They'll get very spicy. Bok choy, cabbage, garlic, kale, lettuce, radishes, spinach, and onions. These are all great examples of garden vegetables that you can grow in a smaller container. It's important to note that with a container of this size, this is 1 cubic foot of soil. Again, you should refer to the bag of potting mix to see how much soil you're going to be getting in there. Some bags will quantify it in cubic feet, some quantify it in liters, so you may have to do a little bit of conversion there. But again, in a 12 by 12 by 12 container, you will need 1 cubic foot of soil in order to fill up that pot. Just be sure that in a container this size, that if you are planting multiple plants, you can save space, but you want to avoid overcrowding, especially with vegetables, because these plants are going to be competing with each other for air, water, and nutrients, and the production that you get out of your plant may not be as vigorous as you would have liked. So for medium rooted vegetables, these are vegetables that are appropriate for containers of about 18 by 24. This is about 3 to 4 cubic feet of soil mix. There's a wider array of vegetables, larger vegetables that you can grow in this sort of application: your brassicas, your broccoli, your cauliflower, celery, collards, corn, of course, vertically supported as well on the corn side. Bush beans are a great thing that you can grow in this size of container. Chilies, potatoes, turnips. There's really a wider variety of things that you can grow in a medium size container. Again, you're going to need to put a little bit more soil into this container than the previous one. 3 to 4 cubic feet of soil is recommended, will be necessary for this size of container. And then finally, deep rooted vegetables. So we're talking about plants that are appropriate for containers of about 24 inches wide by 36 inches deep, so 2 feet by 3 feet. These containers are large. A container this size will require 12 cubic feet of soil to fill up, but are appropriate for things like carrots, especially longer ones that are going to go deeper into the soil. Eggplants, tomatoes, you're going to need a big container like this. Although it is important to note that when you are growing these plants in smaller containers, they will survive, but they will likely be smaller, require more water, and will probably yield less of those good vegetables that you're hoping to get out of it at the end of the day. There are lots of really great options for edibles and containers if you have a shade garden. I will just say that these are shade tolerant edibles. Most plants really do prefer to have some sun, but there are some edibles that will produce for you in partial shade and a few in full shade. Again, the production may be less than if you were growing them in a full sun situation, but you have to be careful in this sort of situation not to overwater. Again, in the shadier environment where there's less sun to dry out that soil, these containers are more apt to be overwatered, but you can enjoy some fruits of your labor in a shadier site. You're going to want to map your balcony or your outside area to know exactly how much sun is going to be available in each one of these situations. Again, pollination is really critical in a container garden if you're going to be growing edibles. If pollination doesn't occur in your garden, you're not going to be getting any fruit development or vegetable development. Essentially, no pollination, no tomatoes, right? Pollination can occur by many different vectors, primarily, and in nature, it's mostly done by insects like bees, hoverflies, and the like. They flit around from plant to plant and help to pollinate things, which is very helpful, but also birds, mammals, and other creatures can also help to support pollination. People can also hand pollinate. If you find that your fruits or vegetables are blooming, but they're not producing fruit, you may have a challenge with pollination in your yard. So you can actually take a little toothbrush or a paintbrush and actually put that paintbrush into the flower itself, get that pollen and go from flower to flower. I had to do this for some squash I had growing in my yard last year. It is an option for you. If you're on a balcony way up, or if you're in an enclosed pollinator, these are not going to be particularly friendly spaces for pollinators. They're going to be harder for them to reach. So if you don't see bees or other insects in your garden on a regular basis, hand pollination may be the approach you'll need to take. Just a message here too, pollinators don't just need the pollen, they need water as well. Just like bird baths, you may want to consider adding supplemental water to your garden to support pollinators. Pollinators need water for drinking, for cooling, and for reproduction. Butterflies, for example, will gather and sip at shallow pools, mud puddles, or even bird baths. You may already have a natural source of water in your environment, but if you don't, you can consider putting together a nice little pollinator-friendly watering fountain. This is one that I created using some guidance from a YouTube video. It's basically a plastic pot that I've inserted into another plastic pot with some water in it, with some mosquito dunks in there, so you're preventing mosquito larvae from growing. There is a solar solar powered water pump inside that 2-liter bottle. It slowly bubbles the water up to prevent the growth of algae and the like. But as you can see, this really brings the pollinators to the yard. I've seen many little bees, butterflies, and the like chilling out in this little backyard hot tub that I created for them. This is also a little bit more protected than the bird bath that we have. So many pollinators could be victimized by birds and eaten by them. So you want to make sure that they have a nice, safe place to take a sip in your yard. So a couple of tips here in terms of potting up your plant, starting with preparing the potting medium. You should be starting with a quality potting mix, right? That does have that fertilizer put in there. If it doesn't, you're going to be needing to amend or fertilize that soil if necessary. It's also a good idea to moisten the soil when you pot the plant up to provide a nice moist environment for that plant for success. Best bet here, compost and manure are amendments that can improve the texture and quality of the soil and add nutrients in terms of that fertilization. But again, if you do have potting mix that comes pre-fertilized, it shouldn't be necessary for at least the first 6 to 8 weeks. You're also going to want to prepare the container, clean them, especially if you're recycling a pot from the previous season to decrease the chance of disease. If you are sensitive to the visual aspect of accumulated salts or moss on the outside of your pot, this is also a good opportunity to clean those up. You do want to cover that drainage hole with a screen or a coffee filter to prevent soil loss out of the bottom. Again, probably a good bet to avoid container saucers and rather use pot feet to make sure that the water is not standing there and rotting out the soil. If you do use the saucers, you want to monitor it for standing water so that you can empty it out periodically to avoid root rot, salt buildup, and mosquitoes. Just a note here on special fillers. Sometimes folks put stuff in the bottom of your pot to make it lighter or to save on the potting mix, or maybe you just know that the root ball of your plant is not going to necessarily need that entire space. So some folks can put stuff like rocks or whatever in the bottom of your pot. I'll just say that using fillers is not necessarily recommended unless there's no other option, like you really just don't have enough soil and you need to put something else in there. The reason why this can be problematic for plants is this concept called a perched water table. So you can see in the example here that the gravel in the pot on the right essentially moves the water table in the container higher up, and this can have a negative impact on the plant. It can lead to waterlogged soil, which will deprive the plant roots of oxygen and could potentially cause root rot and stunted growth. If you absolutely must put some special fillers in the bottom of your plant, you should be using non-biodegradable fillers like crushed up aluminum cans or foam pellets. But again, it's not really a recommended strategy. A lot of folks are challenged by overwintering their containers, especially because, and a lot of folks don't know this, roots are the least hardy part of your plant. So they're going to need a little bit of protection in the winter months. There are a lot of strategies that you can use to overwinter your plants that are planted in containers, including insulating them. You can wrap them up with bubble wrap. You can put a healthy layer of mulch on the top or straw to make sure that that average temperature is a little higher. You can move these containers into a shed or garage. A lot of tender perennials or tropicals do just fine over winter in a garage situation with a little bit of water periodically. So that's something you can consider. If you do have some in-ground territory that you can also use, you can also remove your potted plants from the pots, put them into the ground over winter with some mulch on the top, and then repot them again in the soil. This is called trenching. It is a strategy for people who do have some of that extra space that you could do this. Just some reminders that if you do have potted evergreens or needled plants, those are going to need some more water in the dry periods in the winter. Don't do it where it's below freezing, obviously, but if you're getting into a dry period and it's not freezing, you're going to want to give them a sip of water now and then. The freeze-thaw cycle does damage pots, especially clay. We talked about the glazed pots earlier, so keep that in mind. You don't want those pots to be sitting in standing water. That could potentially freeze and crack those pots. So those sorts of sensitive pots you should probably be taking inside. And also, if you are going to be leaving your pots outside, you may want to stack them in a protected corner to make sure that they're more protected from the wind and the colds. If there's a heavy snow or an ice storm, that frozen water that's collected at the top of the pot can be problematic for the plant. Stacking the pots, again, is a good way to avoid that, or putting a mulch layer on the top so there's not as much area for that water to accumulate. Just a couple last slides here in terms of some cool things to try. Many types of fruit trees do very well in containers. You should do a little bit of research when you're selecting the right fruit tree for your particular area. You should know the difference between dwarf and semi-dwarf varieties because they can have a dramatically different growth habit and size. You should also be selecting self-fruiting plants if you're only going to have one example of these plants in your garden. Like citrus or peaches are a great example of self-fruiting plants. There are others like blueberries where you would need to have multiple multiple plants with different genetics in the same container garden in order for them to pollinate with each other and to produce fruit. You can ask your vendor for guidance on whether or not your plant that you're selecting is self-rooting or not. Most fruit trees do require a full sun situation, and they will need relatively larger pots, relatively deeper pots. Fruit trees in containers do require quote unquote low analysis fertilizer. So this means that those numbers on that fertilizer should be low, like a 513 is a good example of a low analysis fertilizer. Fish emulsion is also a great thing to use for fruit trees in your container gardening. You'll also need to consider pruning on a seasonal basis. Generally, fruit trees in containers won't get to be super big, but some pruning may be required. Your goal should be to encourage sunlight and air access to promote flowering and fruiting in the situation. And then when it comes to overwintering, it's going to depend on the fruit. This lovely orange tree is not going to survive in Northern Virginia in the winter, so you're going to have to bring it indoors. Roses are also a really great option for container gardening. These can be those thrillers in the center of your larger containers. Most roses do have a significant root system, so really small pots aren't going to be very appropriate for them. Your pot should also be pretty well draining and again, deep enough to accommodate the roots. They like a variety of pot types from terracotta to plastic. They can, if they grow large, will have a potential for tipping over, so you're going to want to choose a larger container. A reminder that roses are heavy feeders, so putting them in a rich potting medium, potentially amended with compost, is always a good strategy. You can repot smaller roses relatively easily in containers every few years to refresh that soil. You can also divide those roses if that's an appropriate strategy for them. There are specific types of roses that you should be putting in containers over others. It's not a good idea to put a big rambler or climber in this sort of situation, but there are ground cover roses, miniature roses, patio roses, and a specific type of rose called a polyantha that bears clusters of small roses on a shorter plant that are all really great options for container gardens. So definitely check out some of those types of roses for your container garden situation. Again, if you do have a lot of shade in your area, you can still make a big impact with the shade garden. A lot of shady plants really rely on the visual interest of the foliage versus the blossoms. There's a lot of really great native plants to Northern Virginia and the East Coast in general, like trillium or hay-scented ferns that could work well in a shaded container and give you some visual interest all season long. Again, in the shade, there's not as much sun to evaporate that moisture, so you're going to want to avoid overwatering. And again, you're going to want to make sure that the plants you're putting into this pot have the same requirements. Finally, just wrapping up here with a couple of really interesting ideas. Maybe you're an old hat at container gardening, you want to try some new stuff. Porch pots are a really interesting thing to try for seasonal interest. That pot on the right there is an example of a container that's essentially being zhuzhed up for the holiday season. You can festoon these types of pots with foraged materials like evergreen branches or twigs for visual interest. You can put holiday ornaments on them. There's a lot of good resources in a couple of links in the resource pages that we sent out in advance of this session that you can rely on to maybe think about more about porch pots. But just remember that foraging in places that are forbidden, like state parks, is a no. Just don't do that, and be mindful not to take things from the wild that are threatened or native. If you're into collecting unique plants or specimen species plants, container gardening can be a great way to do that. Here's a little bit of an example of an outdoor cactus and succulent garden collection. This is actually a picture from Monaco that I took over the summer last year out in front of a little store. You can have a nice little collection. I'm growing, as Annette mentioned, a winter hardy cactus collection out back, agaves, yuccas, and many columnar and globular cacti and succulents. Many of them are cold hardy. They come from high elevations in the desert Southwest and other parts of the Americas and are entirely appropriate to grow in our neighborhood. You should probably avoid Opuntia species, aka prickly pears, as they do have pretty nasty thorns, are called glochids, that can get stuck in your hands, and also they don't have a lot of visual interest in the wintertime. Finally, if you're handy or know someone who is, like my partner, who's really into woodworking, you can also consider making your own containers. So these 3 cedar boxes in this picture, these are brand new. My partner made these for me over the last month or so using simple cedar fence pickets, some landscape fabric to line the inside with some staples, some galvanized screws and 2x4s to provide the structure, and then some wheels on the bottom. You can buy a dolly for pretty inexpensive price points at big box stores, probably save you a few bucks over buying buying the wheels individually, which can be kind of expensive, especially with larger containers like those that are in the picture that are going to be for my tomatoes this year. They will be very heavy, especially when they're watered. So making sure that you have those wheels so that you can wheel them around and have them be mobile is going to be very important for you. So wrapping up, Annette, any final questions we can answer for folks?
We had a couple people ask questions about basically quarantining pots before you bring them in or out. Specifically, one person asked about quarantining, another asked if you have any suggestions on how to discourage ants from making a home before you bring them in for the winter. So, not sure if you have any thoughts about that.
Yes, this is a really great point. Thank you for asking this question. When you do bring your pots, like your house plants, out for the summer and then bring them back in at the end of the growing season, there is a possibility that you're going to be bringing nasty stuff in and outside with them. So quarantining those pots is a good idea. If you have a garage or something like that, you can keep it there for a little while and slowly transition those plants inside. When you're on the opposite side, bringing them out at the beginning of the growing season, you will also need to transition those plants slowly. It can be a bit of a shock for some houseplants to go directly outside. I made this mistake once with an orchid. I almost lost it. Bring that plant outside a little bit, like an hour the first day, 2 hours the next day, slowly transition it over time. But yes, pest can be an issue when you're bringing these plants back inside. I would recommend if you are encountering issues with ants or other pests in your containers, you may want to repot that or something before you bring it inside. Dig down underneath and make sure there's not an ant nest already in there. There are commercially available things that you can put into your plant to discourage those pests from living in there. And that's definitely not something you want to bring into your house. Absolutely.
Two other very quick, specific questions. Earlier on, someone asked about drainage holes and a challenge with keeping them open. I heard you say coffee filters. Do you have any other suggestions to help keeping those from becoming clogged?
Absolutely. So you can also buy at big box stores or online, actually like little mesh circles that are specifically made for this application. They're less likely to get clogged up. I will say that when I have plastic pots, even if they come with the drainage hole, usually I drill a secondary hole just to be sure. Because silt and other sort of fine particulates can potentially clog up those holes over time, which is not going to be really good, especially with a plastic pot situation. Probably less of an issue with terracotta or some clay. But yeah, those are some things you can do. Some more traditional methods that folks have used in the past is if you have a broken terracotta pot, you can use, a piece of that and put it right over there. And that could help to discourage the soil from coming out as well. Really anything that's going to screen it out is going to probably work for you. That coffee filter could get clogged up as well. And since it's fabric and it's a little bit less durable, it is possible for that to break or bust open. And so if you see a lot of soil coming out at the bottom of your pot, that might be an indication that you need to redo that one.
Okay. So very last question, just to put it out there, was about preventing hornworms on container tomatoes, if you have any suggestions.
Pick them off.
Okay,
That's
great.
what I'm gonna do. Pick
Quick
them off.
answer.
The good news is that they're really big and they're easy to clock. You want to check out for the signs of the eggs as well. You want to get rid of those. There are beneficial insects that you can introduce into your garden as well if that's what you like to do.
Thank you, Ben, so much. It's been a great presentation and you've gotten a lot of kudos in the chat, so I'm sure you'll get to read those later. I do want to just say thank you to Catherine. Also, she's done a fabulous job with the chat and answering some of your questions and providing a lot of extra information. Thank you again, everyone, for attending. Especially thank you to Ben for doing such a great job with this presentation.
Thanks,
So,
Annette. Everybody.
all right.